Hi everyone, welcome back to Extra Credit, and this is our 15th episode on ancient Greece. So last time we left the Greeks in their darkest hour of all, with the great King Xerxes having finally achieved his lifelong dream of reducing Athens to a heap of smoldering ruins. Meanwhile, the allied Greek navy had gathered in a narrow strip of water squeezed between the mainland and the fateful island of Salamis. And it was here that they would make their final stand in what they prayed was the right answer to the irritatingly and inconveniently vague words of the Oracle of Delphi. With Athens itself now a pile of rubble, Themistocles and his countrymen had no choice but to put their trust in the wooden wall of warships that was now the only thing that stood between Greece and destruction in what would become one of the most decisive turning points in all of history. Or again, maybe the 8-ball lady really was just talking about sausage. I mean, who really knows? So in September of 480 BC, as the warships of Xerxes' fleet closed in on the terrified allies at Salamis, it was clear that one way or the other, for better or worse, the end of the long struggle was finally in sight. And with at least 600 Persian ships stacked up against the Greeks' remaining 310, there was no question of where the advantage lay. On top of that, for all his brilliance in the struggle so far, the Athenian commander Themistocles knew that this time his master plan had one glaring flaw. His entire strategy hinged on getting the Persian navy bogged down in the narrow strip of water where their numbers would work against them, essentially recreating the conditions of Thermopylae on water. But unlike Thermopylae, where the landscape demanded it, this time Xerxes had no good reason to send his troops into a position that so obviously favored his enemies. In fact, for all anybody could see, Xerxes might as well just sit on the beach and watch the Greek alliance crumble into chaos while he planned where to set up his new jacuzzi on the Acropolis. Hence the flaw. But as the allied leaders argued frantically amongst themselves, to nobody's surprise, it was once again the big brain of Themistocles that saved the day with a secret weapon: sickness. No, not that kind of sickness. Sickness was actually the name of one of Themistocles' household slaves, and it was a combination of his bravery and his master's brain power that gave the Greeks a fighting chance. Herodotus tells us that on Themistocles' orders, Sickness got into a small boat by nighttime and sailed across to the Persian camp, where he asked to speak to their commanders-in-chief. Pretending that he was betraying his Greek masters, Sickness pulled off the ultimate deception by simply telling the truth. Namely, that the Greeks were in total chaos and getting ready to bolt in all directions, so if Xerxes seized his chance now, he would never have a better opportunity to crush the Greeks once and for all. Unsurprisingly, when Xerxes heard this news, he snapped at the bait, and by sunset on the following day, both sides of the strait had been sealed off by the great king's warships, effectively trapping the Greeks in jaws of steel, which was exactly where Themistocles wanted them. Because as terrifying as the odds against them still were, at least now the game was being played by his rules. Hours later, after a sleepless night, the Allied forces roused themselves and watched the dawn break on one of the most fateful days in human history. With his whole life having led to this moment, Themistocles stood before his countrymen and delivered a stirring speech in which he contrasted the better aspects of human nature and society with the worse, urging his fellow citizens to do nothing more or less than to choose what is better. And with this cry ringing in their ears, the Greeks suited up. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, as the sun crested over the Aegean Sea, Xerxes took his place on a special throne that had been set up on a nearby hilltop to command a splendid view of the entire scene. In a thoughtful gesture to help his men give 100%, Xerxes had informed his commanders that he would personally be watching the battle and taking note of any outstanding performances, whether good or bad. Because hey, I mean, it worked for Sauron, right? So with his sea forces ready at last, Xerxes gave the order to put the final nail in the coffin of Greece once and for all. But as the Persian ships eased forwards into the strait, the great king's sailors heard a strange sound echoing from the mist in front of them. Not the panic of confusion and chaos, but the sound of singing. because as the fog cleared that morning, it revealed to the horrified Persians not a jumbled mess of fleeing foes, but a single, vast, unbroken line of warships stretching from shore to shore, rams facing forward, ready to fight. Years later, the Greek poet Aeschylus, who personally fought at Salamis, recorded his own version of the stirring song the Greeks sang that morning as they got ready one last time to put everything on the line. Forward, sons of Greece! Free your native home, free your wives, your children, the temples of your fathers' gods, the tombs of your ancestors. The time has come to fight for all of these. Whew, yeah, something in my eye here. Just hold on. Anyhow, with that, a single Greek trireme shot forward from their lines and smashed into a Persian vessel, with the two ships instantly entangled in a struggle to the death. And with that signal, both sides surged forward, and battle was joined. Now, despite the math adding up in his favor, it was pretty clear from the word go that by swallowing Themistocles' bait, Xerxes had actually made a colossal miscalculation. For one thing, by this time in the Persian Wars, in terms of raw skill, the Greek sailors were just better than their enemies. The way Herodotus puts it, this was due to the disciplined and ordered manner in which the Greek fleet fought, whereas the barbarians were so disorganized that they lost all sense of what they were doing, with consequences that were only to be expected. On that note, it also didn't help that in the opening minutes of the battle, a daring Greek commander named Amenius went straight for the Persian flagship and rammed it head-on. Xerxes' own brother was actually commander of this ship, and when he tried to leap onto the Athenian trireme, he was pretty much shish kebabbed in mid-air and hurled into the sea. So, questionable strategy, but 10 for technique. On top of their discipline, though, the Greeks also had the simple advantage belonging to all people born and bred by the sea. Namely, they knew how to swim, which was more than could be said for most of their enemies. Thus, when ships went down, the Greek sailors simply sculled their way over to the nearest shore, whereas for Xerxes' unfortunate men, it was a one-way trip to the bottom of the Aegean. But above all this, what really sealed the Persians' fate was the simple fact that Themistocles' simple plan had worked. The blundering Persian ships just couldn't navigate the narrow waters, and while their lines became a jumbled mess, the Greeks held their positions and were free to pick off Xerxes' ships one by one. All of which was made even easier for the Greeks by the fact that Xerxes' whole Eye of Sauron thing not only failed, but backfired spectacularly. According to Herodotus, this was because the Persian crews in the lines to the rear, who were trying to get past in their ships and demonstrate their own courage and action to the king, went crashing into the ships of their retreating comrades. I know, Xerxes, the whole Dark Lord thing, it's tough to pull off. And so, to make a long story short, what had started as a desperate struggle for Greek survival quickly became a literal bloodbath for the Persians, with the foaming red waters choked with broken timbers and broken men. For his part, a helpless Xerxes could only watch in horror, as in the course of a single day, a half-decade's worth of dreams came crumbling to nothing. The only minuscule silver lining for the great king was that at least one of his captains had put on a good show, a commander named Artemisia, who had the distinction of being the only female to fight at Salamis. After watching Artemisia pull off a particularly gutsy ramming maneuver, Xerxes couldn't help but groan over the pathetic performance of her male comrades, crying out, "My men have become women, and my women men." Ooh, Xerxes, yeah, I don't know how to say this to you, but it's 2024. You can't actually say that anymore. And to be fair, you probably wouldn't have if you would have noticed in the confusion that the ship that Artemisia so bravely rammed was actually one of your own. And there goes the silver lining. But at the end of the day, it just didn't matter anymore, because as the sun began to sink into the sea, the shattered Persians were in full retreat, leaving up to half of their comrades dead in the water behind them. Themistocles' wooden wall had stood firm. The Battle of Salamis has been called by some historians the single most important battle in all of world history. Not only does it make for a thrilling underdog story, but by saving Greece from slavery in so many ways, the victory that morning laid the foundations of the world as we know it today. And even though it had been a team effort, there was no question that the lion's share of the glory and credit belonged firmly to the sailors of Athens who had blazed the way. A century later, the great philosopher Plato would say that because of Salamis, the men of Athens were the fathers not merely of children, but of their children's freedom, and of the freedom of every person who dwells in the continent of the West. Or to let our friend Herodotus sum it up, anyone who proclaims the Athenians the saviors of Greece would hardly be far from the truth. By deciding to help in the preservation of Greek liberty, they stood their ground, held their nerve, and met with the invader of their country. But that invader wasn't finished just yet, because even with his navy a crippled wreck, Xerxes still had a gargantuan land army that would take a miracle for the Greeks to overcome. But really, by this point, I think we kind of know where this is going. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching Extra Credit today. Hopefully you've been sticking with this series so far and are getting ready for the climax in our next episode. This week's pop quiz is, what was the name of Themistocles' slave who helped save the day at Salamis? Answers can go to room 215. As always, work hard, read books, play outside, and we'll see you next time.